Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Tessellations video. Now here on this video I'm going to be showing you how to shade these tessellations. The first tessellation that we're going to be shading is this one, which is composed of squares. Now if we take a look at our reference image, only 2 colors are used to make a checkerboard pattern. Now the first square, as seen on the reference image, it has to be yellow. Now to show more on camera, I'm going to be using a more orangey yellow. However, before I start to completely shade this first square, to avoid confusion, I'm first going to mark all of the squares which are going to be yellow. During this step, make sure that you're marking the squares lightly, so later we'll be able to go over the color once more. Right, now let's alternate to this pink purplish color. And let's mark all the squares that are going to be in this color. Make sure that you're marking them lightly. Just shade a little mark and move on. Now let's start shading the first square. So I have all the squares marked in the appropriate color. And let's grab our yellow and let's start filling in the square. So while shading, it's always recommended to go in one direction. You could also go in one direction, however, back and forth. Please do not alternate directions when shading, otherwise it will not look neat. Now to fill in those empty spaces next to the outline, I'm going to alternate slightly. However, when I alternate, I keep my coloring as light as possible, so no lines would appear in my final drawing. Once again, I kept it lightly, and then I'll go over it again with lines going back and forth in the original direction. Now let's color the second square in this purplish pink. Once again, keep your lines as light as possible. You could first fill in the areas right next to the outlines and then fill in the rest. You could also use the one stroke method as I'm doing here. Now make sure to go over your shading to remove any harsh lines. Just make sure that your square is going to look like it's in one single color. Okay, you could continue this way. Now, I strongly suggest that first you'll color all the squares which are in yellow and then the squares which are in pink. First of all, you'll be able to save time this way. Also, if you by accidentally color outside of the lines, you'll be able to cover it with the darker color, which in this case it's pink. And this is how your final drawing is supposed to look like at the end. Now let's move on to the next tessellation, which is made up of rectangles. Now here, if we take a look at the reference image, all of the rectangles are given a gradient look. Now the colors are going from darkest to lightest, a dark orange to a light yellow. This gradient look helps the tessellation look as if it is 3D. Now let's start by shading our tessellation. So first of all, I'm going to grab my orange color and I'm going to be shading these rectangles from left to right, from darkest to lightest. So if you'd like, while shading, you could use the one-stroke method, so you would be able to start darkly and then end up lightly. Now make sure that your strokes will end up somewhere in the middle of each rectangle. Here, once again, I'm alternating just a little bit just to fill in the area next to the outline. However, I will go over it one more time, so those lines will not be part of my final drawing. Make sure that with shading like this, especially when you have a gradient, you will go in one direction. Now let's go through certain areas which have to be darker. And then let's move on to the yellow color, which has to be placed on the right-hand side of each rectangle. Once again, with the yellow, I'm using the one-stroke method. However, this time I'm moving from right to left and then end up somewhere in the middle, where both colors are going to meet. Now here I'm going to go over the central part of the rectangle to blend those colors together. Please go over it with the yellow, as with a darker color you'll end up creating more lines onto the yellow side. Now I'm going to go over the orange side one more time to darken a little bit the orange shading. Okay, now you can continue like this with each rectangle. Now first I recommend that you will finish with one color and then with the other color. Now I strongly suggest that you'll start with the yellow first. So if you'll by accident color outside of the lines, you'll be able to cover it with the darker color. And this is how your final drawing is supposed to look like. Now the next tessellation is made up of triangles. Now here I've already marked the triangles which are going to be red. Later I'm going to be marking the triangles which are going to be green. Now let's start shading the first 3 triangles of this tessellation. So here I'm going to go through one more time this red triangle, and then I'll show you how to shade the green one. Now what I like to do when shading triangles is pick an apex and then change the angle of my shading according to that apex. Now once again, I'm going to alternate my direction, keeping my strokes as light as possible in order to fill in the area right next to the outline. However, to keep all strokes uniform, I'm going to go over it again, so those lines won't be part of my final drawing. And this is the finished drawing. Now let's move on to the other tessellation. Now the other tessellation is made up of hexagons. So let's take a look at our reference image. And as we can see on our reference image, this tessellation also has a gradient. So in this case, we have to move from darkest to lightest. However, we have two colors which are blending with each other. We have the dark green, which then changes to a yellow. By adding this gradient to the hexagons, we'll be able to make the hexagons look more 3D. So let's start with the dark color, the green. And once again, in one direction, I'm going to start from left to right. However, I'm going to end somewhere in the middle. The strokes will end somewhere in the middle of each hexagon. Now, once again, remember that whenever you alternate your direction, it's always advisable to go over it again with the original strokes, so it won't be part of your final drawing. Otherwise, your drawing will not look neat. And of course, we don't want our final drawing to look messy and with strokes going in all directions. We want them all to be uniform. Now let's move on to the yellow. And make sure that first you'll keep a light hand. You'll be drawing with a light hand. And then you'll go over certain areas to make them darker. Alright, now let's do some touch-ups with the green. And you can do the same with the other hexagons. Now, just like I've said before, I recommend to first finish with one color and then finish with the other. And this is how your final drawing should look like. Now let's move on to the next tessellation, which is made up of octagons and squares. Let's refer to our reference image. And here we only have two flat colors. So the octagons are colored in yellow and the squares are in pink. Shading here should be fairly easy. All you have to do is keep your strokes in one direction, or in one direction but back and forth. Now I strongly recommend that you will first start with the yellow octagons. So if you were to color outside the line, you will be able to cover your mistakes with a darker color. In this case, the darker color is pink. Now let's color the pink squares. Once again, keep your strokes always in one direction. To stop yourself from drawing outside the lines, you could first draw the outlines and then fill in later. Now fill in the rest of the yellow octagons and pink squares. And this is how your final drawing should look like. The next tessellation that we're going to shade is a tessellation made up of hexagons and triangles. Now, to shade this tessellation, it's the same as we did with the octagons and squares. All you have to do is fill in. Always keep your strokes in the same direction. If you find it helpful, you could first draw the outlines and then go over them with the same one-directional stroke. Now you could use the one-stroke method or the back and forth. And this is how the final drawing should look like. Now let's move on to the triangles and squares tessellation. Here we don't have any gradients in the shapes. We only have one solid color assigned to each shape. Being quite a colorful tessellation, I'm going to first mark with color each of the shapes with the assigned colors as we could see on the reference image. Alright, now since I know that the squares are going to be green, I'm going to go ahead and shade the yellow triangles. First I'm going to shade the outlines, shade the areas next to the outlines, and then fill in the rest. Also, to keep everything looking neat, I'll always go over again those lines to make everything seem as if it is going in one direction. Continue in this method. Make sure that when you shade right next to the outline, you keep your strokes very light, so you would easily go over them later on. Alright, now this is how your final drawing should look like. Lastly, we have the rhombus's tessellation. First, let's refer to the reference image. Now on this tessellation, we have to assign different colors to make this tessellation made up of rhombuses look as if it is made of stacked cubes. Now first let's mark all the sides in the assigned colors. And then we could start shading. Now here, while shading to further enhance the 3D effect, Our strokes have to be in one direction according to the sides of the rhombuses. So in this case, I'm only drawing back and forth, up and down strokes with the pink and yellow sides. And then with the green sides, I'm drawing in a 60-degree angle to make it look like as if it is the top of the cubes. Now continue in this method, and this is how your final drawing should look like.